The bitter autumn wind howled across the Kansas prairie, carrying with it the desperation of a woman who had nothing left but the infant clutched to her chest and the small carpetbag in her trembling hand. Victoria Parker stood at the weathered signpost marking the edge of Belmont, her chestnut hair whipping against her tear-streaked face as the stage coach that had abandoned her there disappeared into the dusty horizon of 1875. The setting sun cast long shadows across the rugged landscape, painting the small frontier town in hues of amber and gold. Victoria's legs ached from the journey, her body weak from days of insufficient food and rest. Her daughter, Lily, just 6 months old, had fallen silent against her breast, exhausted from crying throughout the arduous trip from St. Louis. "Hush now, sweet girl," Victoria whispered, though Lily had already succumbed to sleep. "We'll find our way." The town of Belmont, Kansas, wasn't much to look at: a dusty main street lined with wooden storefronts, a small church steeple visible in the distance, and scattered houses spreading outward like dropped matchsticks. It wasn't the grand new beginning Victoria had imagined when she'd fled her old life, but it would have to do. There was no going back. With a deep breath that caught in her throat, Victoria adjusted Lily in her arms and began the walk toward town. Her boots, once fine quality leather, were now scuffed and worn from the journey. The hem of her dress was frayed and dusty, much like her spirits. But determination kept her moving forward, one exhausted step after another. She had made it halfway to the first buildings when Lily began to stir, letting out the hungry cry Victoria had come to dread. Her milk had been dwindling for days, her own body starved of proper nourishment. Victoria's eyes welled with tears of frustration and helplessness. "Just a little further, darling," she pleaded, quickening her pace despite her fatigue. The sound of hoofbeats approaching from behind caused Victoria to stiffen. Out here, alone and vulnerable with a child, she had every reason to be wary. She turned, clutching Lily closer, ready to run if necessary. A large bay horse trotted toward her, its rider a broad-shouldered man with a weathered Stetson pulled low over his eyes. He reined his horse to a stop several paces from her, and Victoria could feel his gaze taking in her bedraggled appearance. "Madam," he said, his voice deep and rough with disuse, "you seem a mite far from town to be on foot with a little one." Victoria straightened her back, summoning what dignity she had left. "The stagecoach driver insisted this was as far as my fare would take me." The man pushed his hat back, revealing a face carved by sun and hardship. His eyes, surprisingly gentle for such a rugged countenance, settled on Lily's tiny form. "Name's Ethan Hayes," he said, dismounting with a fluid grace that spoke of years in the saddle. "Ranch is about 3 miles north of town." He gestured toward Belmont. "You got folks waiting on you." Victoria hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to this stranger. "No," she admitted finally. "We're starting fresh." Ethan nodded, his expression unchanged. "Lot of that going around these parts." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a canteen. "Water." The simple offer nearly broke Victoria's composure. She accepted the canteen with a trembling hand, taking a small sip before dampening her finger and touching it to Lily's parched lips. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Just Ethan's fine." He stood there a moment, seemingly deliberating something. "Town's got a boarding house. Mrs. Miller runs it. Decent enough place for a lady and child if you've got the means." Victoria's silence answered his unspoken question. Ethan cleared his throat. "I was heading to town myself. Would be no trouble to give you a ride in." Relief and wariness battled within Victoria. Her feet ached, her arms were tired from carrying Lily, and the thought of walking into town as darkness fell was daunting. "I would be most grateful," she said finally. With surprising gentleness, Ethan helped Victoria mount his horse, making sure she was settled securely with Lily before climbing up behind her. He kept a respectful distance, his arms reaching around her only enough to grasp the reins. "Hold tight to that little one," he instructed, and urged the horse forward. As they rode toward Belmont, Victoria caught the scent of leather, tobacco, and open prairie that clung to the cowboy. There was something solid and reassuring about his presence, though she knew better than to trust too easily. I'm Victoria, she offered, feeling she owed him at least that much. Victoria Parker, and this is Lily. Pleasure, madam, Ethan replied, his voice rumbling near her ear. Welcome to Belmont, though it ain't much for welcoming strangers. Are you from here originally? Victoria asked, trying to mask her growing anxiety about what awaited them in town. No, madam, came west after the war. Worked cattle drives up from Texas for a spell before settling here about 4 years back. He paused. Town's small but decent folk for the most part. As they crested a small rise, Belmont came fully into view. Lanterns were being lit along the main street, casting warm glows through windows. The town wasn't large by any measure, but to Victoria, it represented her last hope. The boarding house is there. Ethan pointed to a 2-story white building near the church. Mrs. Miller's a fair woman, though she likes her money up front. Victoria's heart sank. Mr. Hayes, Ethan, I should be honest with you. My funds are limited. Ethan was quiet for a moment, the only sound the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves on the packed earth. Town's got a small hotel too, more costly though. I was hoping to find work quickly, Victoria said, her voice stronger than she felt. I'm not afraid of hard labor. Ain't much work for a woman with a young un, Ethan replied bluntly, though his tone held no judgment. Not the respectable kind anyway. They rode into town proper, passing the saloon where piano music spilled onto the street, alongside raucous laughter. Victoria instinctively held Lily closer as several men lounging outside turned to watch their passage with curious eyes. Ethan guided his horse to the hitching post outside a small general store. Store's about to close, but the owner, Harold Cooper, is a decent sort, might be able to direct you somewhere safe for the night. He dismounted first, then carefully helped Victoria down. Her legs nearly buckled beneath her when her feet touched the ground, and Ethan's strong hands steadied her briefly before releasing her. Thank you for your kindness, Victoria said, meaning it more than she could express. Ethan shifted uncomfortably under her gratitude. Wait here a moment, he said, and disappeared into the store. Victoria stood beside the massive bay horse, feeling exposed under the curious stares of passers-by. Lily began to fuss again, her tiny face scrunching up with hunger and discomfort. "SHH, my love," Victoria soothed, gently bouncing her. "We'll find a way." Ethan emerged from the store, followed by an older man with spectacles perched on his nose. The storekeeper studied Victoria and Lily with kind but assessing eyes. "Mrs. Parker, this is Harold Cooper. Owns the mercantile and serves as our town's unofficial welcoming committee," Ethan said with the barest hint of a smile. "Madam," Harold nodded respectfully, "Mr. Hayes tells me you're new to our town and seeking accommodations." "Yes, sir, my daughter and I have just arrived." Victoria tried to look more composed than she felt. Harold exchanged a glance with Ethan. "The boarding house is full up this week with railway surveyors," he explained. "Hotel's got rooms, but—" He trailed off, eyeing her simple dress and the worn carpet bag. "I understand," Victoria said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Is there perhaps work available? I can cook, clean, so the thing is, madam," Harold interrupted gently, "Belmont ain't been kind to single women with children in the past. Folks can be narrow-minded." Victoria felt the world closing in around her. She had come so far, endured so much, only to find more closed doors. Ethan cleared his throat. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, left last month to care for her ailing sister in Topeka." He spoke slowly, as if considering each word. "Place could use a woman's touch, and there's plenty of room for you and the little one. It's honest work with fair pay and board included." Victoria stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. "You're offering me employment as your housekeeper. Need someone to cook and keep things tidy. Got 3 ranch hands who take their meals at the main house too." Ethan shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable with her scrutiny. "It's a respectable position. Mrs. Abernathy was with me near 3 years. Hope bloomed in Victoria's chest, but caution tempered it. "That's very generous, Mr. Hayes, but I couldn't possibly— Ranch is 3 miles north, like I said," Ethan continued, as if he hadn't heard her protest. "Got a small cabin out back where Mrs. Abernathy stayed." It ain't fancy, but it's clean and warm, plenty of room for a crib for the little one. Harold was nodding encouragingly. Ethan Hayes is one of our most respected ranchers, Mrs. Parker. His word is his bond in these parts. Victoria looked between the two men, weighing her limited options. The thought of a warm, safe place for Lily outweighed her reservations about going to a stranger's ranch. "When would you need me to start?" she asked finally. "Tonight, if you're willing," Ethan replied. "Got no food in the house worth eating, and those cowboys of mine will be mighty hungry by sunrise." Victoria found herself nodding. "I accept your offer, Mr. Hayes. Thank you." Relief crossed Ethan's weathered features briefly. "We'll stop at the store for supplies," he said, turning to Harold. "Put it on my account and add whatever the lady needs for herself and the child." Harold beamed. "Of course, Ethan. Come inside, Mrs. Parker. We'll get you sorted." The next hour passed in a blur as Victoria selected basic cooking supplies and a few necessities for herself and Lily. Harold's wife, a plump, cheerful woman named Martha, appeared from the back of the store and immediately took to fussing over Lily, insisting on adding a small jar of preserved milk to their purchases. "Poor lamb needs something in her belly," Martha declared, casting a knowing look at Victoria's thin frame. "And so do you, dear. I've added some bread and cheese for tonight." When they emerged from the store, Ethan had procured a small wagon and transferred their purchases to it. "Thought this might be more comfortable for you and the little one," he explained, helping Victoria up to the seat. The ride to Ethan's ranch took them away from town, following a well-worn trail that wound through rolling prairie. Stars appeared in the darkening sky, more than Victoria had ever seen in St. Louis. Lily had finally settled into sleep, soothed by the gentle rocking of the wagon and the small amount of milk Victoria had been able to feed her from Martha's jar. "It's beautiful out here," Victoria commented, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "Gets lonely," Ethan replied simply, "but peaceful." As they crested a hill, Ethan's ranch came into view. A substantial two-story house stood proudly against the backdrop of a barn and several outbuildings. A corral housed several horses that nickered at their approach. Warm light spilled from the windows, and Victoria could make out the forms of men moving about the yard. "Home sweet home," Ethan murmured, guiding the wagon toward the house. Such as it is. Three cowboys approached as they pulled up, curiosity evident in their expressions. "Boys, this here is Mrs. Parker," Ethan announced. "She'll be taking over for Mrs. Abernathy starting tonight. I expect you to show her the same respect." The men nodded, tipping their hats to Victoria. They introduced themselves as Sam, the oldest with graying temples, Joseph, a stocky man with a friendly smile, and Daniel, barely out of his teens with freckles scattered across his sunburned face. "Mighty pleased to meet you, madam," Sam said, speaking for the group. "We've been surviving on our own cooking since Mrs. Abernathy left, and it ain't been pretty." Victoria couldn't help but smile at their obvious relief. "I'll do my best to remedy that situation, gentlemen." Ethan helped her down from the wagon, then carefully took Lily from her arms. "I'll show you to the cabin, then you can get settled while I bring in the supplies." The cabin, as Ethan had described, was small but well built. It sat about 50 yards behind the main house, offering privacy while remaining close enough for convenience. Inside was a single room with a small iron stove, a bed, a table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair near the window. A door led to a tiny back room where a wash basin and chamber pot were discreetly positioned. "Mrs. Abernathy left some linens in the trunk there," Ethan said, nodding toward a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. "It ain't much, but it's perfect," Victoria interrupted, tears threatening to spill. After weeks of uncertainty and fear, the simple cabin seemed like a palace. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." Ethan looked uncomfortable with her emotion. "I'll bring your things and the supplies." "Take your time getting settled. The boys can wait a bit longer for their supper." Left alone with Lily, Victoria sank onto the bed, allowing herself a moment of relief. The mattress was firm but comfortable, the blankets clean and warm. She laid Lily gently on the bed and began to unpack her meager belongings. By the time Ethan returned with their supplies, Victoria had changed into her cleanest dress and pinned her hair back neatly. Lily was awake and content after another small feeding from the preserved milk. "Kitchen's all yours whenever you're ready," Ethan said, depositing the last of the packages on the table. "No rush, though." Victoria straightened her shoulders. "I'll begin immediately. Would you mind watching Lily for just a moment while I assess the kitchen?" Ethan's expression registered alarm. "I ain't much good with babies, madam. She's just fed and changed. She'll likely sleep," Victoria assured him. "I won't be more than a few minutes." Before he could protest further, Victoria placed Lily in his arms, adjusting his hold with gentle hands. "Support her head just so." "There, you're doing fine." Ethan stood rigid, holding Lily as if she might shatter. The tiny infant looked even smaller against his broad chest, her delicate features peaceful in sleep. Something shifted in Ethan's expression as he looked down at her, a softening around his eyes, a slight relaxation of his jaw. "I'll be right back," Victoria promised, and hurried toward the main house. The kitchen was spacious but neglected, with unwashed dishes piled in the sink and a layer of dust on most surfaces. Victoria rolled up her sleeves and set to work, quickly organizing the space and taking inventory of what she had to work with. When she returned to the cabin 10 minutes later, she found Ethan seated in the rocking chair, still holding Lily. He was speaking to her softly, his rough voice gentled to a rumble. "And that's how we ended up in Kansas," he was saying. "Not the most exciting story for a little lady like yourself, but there it is." Victoria paused in the doorway, something warm spreading through her chest at the sight. Ethan looked up, a faint flush coloring his weathered cheeks. "She's a good listener," he said gruffly, rising carefully to hand Lily back. "The best," Victoria agreed, taking her daughter. "The kitchen is in need of attention, but I can manage a hearty stew for tonight. It should be ready in about an hour." "That'll do just fine." Ethan lingered a moment, seeming reluctant to leave. "If you need anything, I'll be sure to ask," Victoria assured him. With a nod, Ethan departed, leaving Victoria with the task of preparing her first meal as the Hayes Ranch housekeeper while simultaneously caring for Lily. It would be a challenge, but one she was determined to meet. The kitchen came alive under Victoria's touch as she chopped vegetables and browned meat for the stew. She found a basket that would serve as a makeshift cradle for Lily, allowing her to keep the baby nearby as she worked. The three cowboys gave the kitchen a wide berth, clearly intimidated by the flurry of feminine activity, though they occasionally peered in with hopeful expressions as savory aromas began to fill the air. When Victoria finally called them to dinner, the men filed in with the solemnity of churchgoers, taking their seats at the large oak table with murmured thanks. Ethan entered last, freshly washed, his damp hair combed back from his forehead. "Smells mighty fine, Mrs. Parker," Sam commented as Victoria ladled generous portions of stew into earthenware bowls. Victoria had placed Lily's basket on a chair in the corner, where the infant slept soundly, undisturbed by the men's presence. As they ate, Victoria learned more about the Hayes Ranch and its operations. Ethan was a cattle rancher primarily, though he kept horses as well. The ranch wasn't the largest in the county, but was well respected for the quality of its stock. "Mr. Hayes fought with distinction in the war," Joseph informed her proudly between mouthfuls of stew. Ethan shot him a warning look. "That's enough of that talk, Joe." Victoria noted the subject change but didn't press. Many men who'd survived the Civil War preferred not to discuss those dark years. As the meal progressed, Victoria observed the easy camaraderie among the men. They treated Ethan with clear respect, but without the fear or blind obedience she might have expected. There was genuine loyalty in their interactions, speaking to Ethan's character as an employer and a man. When they had finished eating and praised her cooking with enthusiastic sincerity, the cowboys helped clear the table without being asked. Young Daniel even offered to wash the dishes, though his technique left much to be desired. "I can manage," Victoria assured him, taking the dishcloth from his soap-covered hands. "You've all had a long day." The men bid her good night and filed out to their quarters in the bunkhouse, leaving Victoria alone with Ethan. "That was the best meal we've had since Mrs. Abernathy left, Ethan said, lingering by the doorway. Thank you, you're welcome. It was the least I could do after your kindness today. Victoria continued washing dishes, aware of his presence behind her. About your wages, Ethan began. Mrs. Abernathy received $20 a month plus room and board. Would that arrangement suit you? Victoria nearly dropped the plate she was washing. $20 was more than she had dared hope for. That would be more than fair, Mr. Hayes. Good then. Ethan shifted his weight. Breakfast at sunrise for the hands. I usually take mine after the morning chores. I'll be ready, Victoria promised. Ethan nodded, his gaze drifting to Lily's sleeping form. She's mighty small. 6 months next week, Victoria said, a smile softening her features. Though she was born early and has always been on the small side. Ethan seemed to want to say more, but instead tipped his hat slightly. Night then, Mrs. Parker. Good night, Mr. Hayes. After finishing the dishes, Victoria gathered Lily and returned to their cabin. The night had grown chilly, and she quickly lit the small stove, grateful for the warmth it provided. As she prepared for bed, Victoria found herself thinking about the unexpected turn her journey had taken. That morning she had been desperate and afraid, with no idea where she and Lily would sleep that night. Now they had a roof over their heads, food in their bellies, and the promise of steady employment. It seemed almost too fortunate to be true. As she drifted off to sleep with Lily nestled beside her, Victoria wondered about the quiet rancher who had extended such kindness to strangers. There was a sadness in Ethan Hayes's eyes, a wounded quality beneath his stoic exterior that resonated with her own hidden sorrows. The dawn came early on the Kansas prairie, painting the eastern sky with strokes of gold and crimson as Victoria made her way to the main house. She had risen before sunrise, feeding and changing Lily before wrapping her snugly and carrying her to the kitchen. The house was quiet, though Victoria could hear movement from the bunkhouse where the cowboys were preparing for the day. She quickly set to work, stoking the kitchen fire and preparing a hearty breakfast of flapjacks, bacon, and eggs. By the time the men arrived, the kitchen was warm and filled with the aroma of fresh coffee. "Morning, Mrs. Parker," Sam greeted, the others echoing him as they filed in, their faces still creased with sleep but their eyes brightening at the sight of food. "Good morning, gentlemen," Victoria replied, placing a towering stack of flapjacks on the table. "Help yourselves." The men needed no further encouragement, diving into the meal with appreciative murmurs. Victoria noticed Ethan's absence but remembered he took his breakfast later. As she moved between the stove and table, refilling coffee cups and adding more bacon to the platter, Victoria listened to the cowboys' conversation, learning more about the ranch's operations and daily rhythms. "Storm's brewing," Joseph commented, glancing out the window at the gathering clouds. "Probably hit by midday. Best get the north herd moved to the lower pasture then," Sam replied, reaching for another flapjack. "That creek rises fast when it rains." After the cowboys had finished eating and headed out to their chores, Victoria tidied the kitchen and checked on Lily, who was contentedly cooing in her basket. The sound of boots on the porch announced Ethan's arrival. "Morning," he said, removing his hat as he entered. His hair was damp from washing, his face freshly shaved. "Hope the boys left something for me." "Plenty," Victoria assured him, placing a fresh plate before him as he sat. "They mentioned a storm coming." Ethan nodded, pouring coffee from the pot she'd kept warm. "First real autumn storm by the looks of it. Might want to bring extra firewood to your cabin today. Nights get cold when the rain sets in." Victoria appreciated his practical concern. "I will, thank you." As Ethan ate, Victoria busied herself with preparations for the midday meal, occasionally glancing at Lily, who had fallen back asleep. The comfortable silence between them was broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. "Mrs. Parker," Ethan said finally, pushing his empty plate away. "Might I ask what brings a lady like yourself to Belmont? Alone with a child, I mean." Victoria stilled, her hands hovering over the dough she was kneading for bread. She had known the question would come eventually, had prepared a version of the truth that revealed enough without exposing her deepest wounds. "My husband died," she said, the practiced words coming easier than she expected. There was nothing left for us in St. Louis, so I decided to start fresh somewhere new. Ethan studied her, his keen eyes seeming to look beyond her carefully composed expression. I'm sorry for your loss, he said simply. Thank you. Victoria returned to her kneading, pressing perhaps harder than necessary into the dough. Belmont's a small town, Ethan continued carefully. People will ask questions. Victoria met his gaze directly. I'm a widow seeking honest work to support my child. That's all anyone needs to know. Ethan held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. Fair enough. He rose from the table. I'll be working with the herd today, moving them before the storm. Probably won't be back till supper time. After he'd gone, Victoria exhaled slowly, releasing the tension that had built in her shoulders. She hadn't lied, not exactly. Her husband was indeed dead to her, though not in the way Ethan had assumed. The gold band she still wore on her finger was both shield and deception protection against certain questions and unwanted attentions. As the morning progressed, Victoria fell into a rhythm of work that was both familiar and comforting. She baked bread, prepared a hearty stew for the evening meal, and began cleaning the neglected house room by room. Lily remained content, alternating between sleeping and watching Victoria's movements with bright, curious eyes. The storm arrived shortly after midday, just as Joseph had predicted. Rain lashed against the windows, and wind howled around the corners of the house. Victoria had just finished cleaning the parlor when a particularly violent gust rattled the panes. Lily, startled by the noise, began to cry. Victoria hurried to comfort her, lifting the baby into her arms and soothing her with gentle words. As she paced the kitchen, bouncing Lily gently, the back door burst open, admitting a drenched and mud-splattered Ethan. "Mr. Hayes," Victoria exclaimed, startled by his sudden appearance. Ethan removed his sodden hat, water streaming from his oilskin coat onto the floor. "Creek's rising faster than expected," he explained tersely. "Boys are bringing in the herd from the north pasture. Gonna be a long, wet afternoon." His gaze fell on Lily, who had quieted at the sound of his deep voice. "Storm frightening her, a little," Victoria admitted. "She's not used to such sounds." Ethan crossed to the stove, extending his hands to the warmth. "Storms out here can get fierce. You'll both get used to them in time." In time. The simple phrase carried an implication of permanence that Victoria hadn't allowed herself to consider. How long would they stay at the Hayes Ranch? How long before her past caught up with her? "Is there anything I can do to help with the herd?" she asked, pushing aside her troubling thoughts. Ethan shook his head. "Just keep a hot meal ready. We'll be half drowned and starving by the time we're done." He hesitated, then added, "Might want to prepare the spare bedroom upstairs. If the creek floods, the boys won't be able to get back to the bunkhouse tonight." Victoria nodded. "I'll see to it right away." Ethan studied her for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. "You're handling all this mighty well, Mrs. Parker." Before Victoria could respond, he had slipped back into his hat and was gone, the door closing firmly against the howling wind. The afternoon passed slowly as the storm intensified. Victoria prepared the spare bedroom as Ethan had requested, finding clean linens in a hall closet. The room was spartanly furnished with 2 double beds and a chest of drawers, but it was clean and dry, a luxury the Cowboys would appreciate after hours in the deluge. As dusk approached, the rain showed no sign of abating. Victoria kept the stew simmering on the stove and baked 2 apple pies, using preserved fruit she'd found in the pantry. Lily, exhausted from the excitement of the day, had finally fallen into a deep sleep, allowing Victoria to work uninterrupted. It was nearly 7 o'clock when Victoria heard the sound of horses in the yard. Looking out the kitchen window, she saw Ethan and his men, sodden and mud-covered, dismounting wearily. They led their horses toward the barn, heads bent against the driving rain. Victoria quickly set the table and ladled generous portions of stew into bowls. She sliced the fresh bread and arranged it on a platter, then checked that the coffee was hot and strong. By the time the men stomped onto the porch, she had everything ready. They entered like a wave of mud and rainwater, bringing the storm's violence with them in their drenched clothes and exhausted faces. "Get those boots off before you come any further," Victoria commanded, surprising herself with her authoritative tone. "There are towels by the door and dry socks on the chair. I won't have you catching your deaths of cold in my kitchen." The cowboys exchanged amused glances but obeyed, removing their boots and outer garments. Ethan was the last to enter, his movements stiff with cold and fatigue. "All the cattle accounted for?" Victoria asked as she poured coffee for each man. "Every last one," Sam confirmed proudly. "Mr. Hayes here rode into the creek itself to save a calf that got caught in the current." Victoria's eyes widened as she turned to Ethan. "You could have drowned." Ethan shrugged uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. "Creek wasn't that deep, just fast-moving." "He's being modest, madam," Daniel piped up. "That water was chest-high on his horse, and the current nearly took them both downstream." Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. The thought of Ethan being swept away by floodwaters disturbed her more than she cared to admit. "Well, you're all safe now," she said briskly, covering her emotion with practicality. "Eat while it's hot. I've prepared the upstairs bedroom for you three," she added, addressing the cowboys. "Mr. Hayes thought you might not be able to reach the bunkhouse tonight. Creek's already over its banks," Joseph confirmed. "Bunkhouse might as well be on the other side of the world tonight." The men ate with the focused intensity of the truly hungry, praising Victoria's cooking between mouthfuls. Ethan was quieter than the others, and Victoria noticed him wincing slightly when he reached for his coffee cup. "Are you injured, Mr. Hayes?" she asked quietly when the cowboys were distracted by the appearance of pie. Ethan glanced up, surprise flashing across his features at her observation. "It's nothing. Shoulder got wrenched a bit in the creek." Victoria frowned. "You should let me look at it after supper." "No need to trouble yourself," Ethan replied, his tone closing the subject. Victoria chose not to press the issue in front of the others. But she observed him carefully throughout the meal, noting how he favored his right arm and the tight lines of pain around his mouth. After the cowboys had eaten their fill and excused themselves to the spare room, Victoria cleared the table while Ethan remained seated, staring into his coffee cup with a distant expression. "Let me see your shoulder now," Victoria said, her tone brooking no argument. Ethan looked up, clearly intending to refuse again, but something in her determined expression made him reconsider. "It's just a sprain," he muttered, but he didn't resist when Victoria moved behind his chair. "Remove your shirt, please," she instructed, keeping her voice clinically detached. Ethan hesitated, then slowly unbuttoned his shirt, wincing as he slid it from his shoulders. Victoria's breath caught at the sight before her. His back was a map of old scars, long, thin lines that could only have been made by a whip, overlaid with the fresh bruising that mottled his right shoulder. She composed herself quickly, touching the bruised area with gentle fingers. Ethan flinched, muscles tensing beneath her touch. "This needs cold compresses and liniment," Victoria pronounced, striving for a professional tone despite the emotion welling within her. Those scars told a story one of suffering endured and survived that resonated with her own hidden wounds. "Cabinet above the sink," Ethan directed tersely. "Mrs. Abernathy kept medical supplies there." Victoria found the liniment and prepared a cold compress while Ethan sat silently, his broad shoulders hunched slightly forward. When she returned to him, she worked in silence, applying the compress first to reduce the swelling, then massaging the liniment into the bruised muscle with firm but gentle strokes. Beneath her ministrations, Ethan gradually relaxed, his breathing deepening. Victoria's fingers traced the edge of one of the old scars inadvertently, and she felt him tense again. "Prison camp," he said abruptly, answering her unspoken question. "Last year of the war," Victoria's hands stilled momentarily. "I'm sorry," she said softly, continuing her careful massage. "Long time ago now," Ethan replied, his voice distant. When she had finished, Victoria stepped back, wiping her hands on a towel. "You should rest it tomorrow if possible." Ethan gave a short laugh. "Not much rest to be had on a ranch, Mrs. Parker." "Victoria," she said impulsively. "You may call me Victoria," It seems silly to stand on formality when I've just had my hands all over your bare back." A flush colored Ethan's cheeks, and he hurriedly drew his shirt back on, wincing only slightly as he worked his injured arm into the sleeve. "Thank you for your help." "Victoria," he said, her name sounding strange but not unpleasant on his lips. "You're welcome, Ethan." She busied herself with returning the liniment to the cabinet, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the moment. Lily's cry from her basket broke the tension. Victoria moved quickly to lift her, noting that she was wet and hungry. "I should take her back to the cabin," she said, cradling Lily against her shoulder. Ethan rose, looking out the window at the still raging storm. "Let me walk you over. It's coming down hard out there." "There's no need," Victoria began, but Ethan was already reaching for his coat. "I insist," he said firmly. He found an oilcloth large enough to cover both Victoria and Lily, and with Ethan sheltering them further with his broad frame, they made the dash to the cabin. Despite their precautions, they were both damp by the time they reached the door. Inside, the cabin was cold, the fire having died down in Victoria's absence. Ethan immediately set about rekindling it while Victoria changed Lily's wet diaper. "Thank you," Victoria said as the fire began to catch, sending welcome warmth through the small space. Ethan straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Least I could do." He glanced around the cabin, seeming to truly notice it for the first time. "It's smaller than I remembered." "You sure you're comfortable here? It's perfect," Victoria assured him. "More than I could have hoped for yesterday." Their eyes met across the small room, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the strange circumstances that had brought them together and the tentative trust that was forming. "I should get back," Ethan said, breaking the moment. "The boys will be wondering where I've gone." "Of course." Victoria adjusted Lily in her arms. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Victoria." He paused at the door. "If you need anything, I know where to find you," she finished with a small smile. After he'd gone, Victoria fed Lily and settled her in the makeshift crib she'd fashioned from a drawer. As she prepared for bed herself, Victoria reflected on the day's events and the man at the center of them. Ethan Hayes was not what she had expected. Behind his rough exterior and taciturn manner was a man of courage and quiet kindness. The scars on his back spoke of suffering endured, yet he had built a life of purpose and integrity in this wild place. As Victoria drifted towards sleep with the sound of rain on the roof, she found herself wondering what other stories were written in those scars, and what scars Ethan might find on her own heart if she ever dared to reveal them. The storm continued through the night, but by morning it had diminished to a gentle drizzle. Victoria woke before dawn, her body already adjusting to the ranch's rhythms. Lily slept peacefully, allowing Victoria to dress quickly and make her way to the main house to prepare breakfast. The kitchen was quiet and still warm from the banked fire in the stove. Victoria quickly revived it and began mixing biscuit dough, grateful for the familiar task to occupy her hands while her mind wandered. She had been at the Hayes Ranch for only a day, yet already the place felt more like home than anywhere she had lived in years. There was an honesty to life here, a straightforward purpose that appealed to her after so much deception and fear. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced the Cowboy's approach. They entered the kitchen with sheepish smiles, looking more rested than they had the previous night. "Morning, Mrs. Parker," Sam greeted, the others echoing him. "Something smells mighty fine." "Biscuits and gravy," Victoria replied, pleased by their enthusiasm. "Coffee's hot if you'd like to pour yourselves a cup." The men needed no further invitation, helping themselves to coffee before settling at the table. Victoria noticed their curious glances toward the doorway. "Mr. Hayes not up yet?" Joseph asked, voicing their collective thought. Victoria frowned slightly. Ethan had struck her as an early riser. "I haven't seen him this morning." Sam and Joseph exchanged concerned looks. "That ain't like him," Sam said. "Man's usually first one up, last one to bed." A tendril of worry curled through Victoria's chest. Perhaps his shoulder is bothering him more than he let on. "What happened to his shoulder?" Daniel asked. Victoria explained about Ethan's injury from the creek rescue, watching the cowboy's expressions grow increasingly concerned. "I'll check on him after breakfast," Sam decided. "Boss has a way of pushing through when he ought to be resting." Victoria nodded, turning back to her cooking but unable to shake her worry. By the time she had served the cowboys their breakfast, her concern had grown to the point that she could no longer ignore it. "I'll go," she said abruptly, removing her apron. "You men eat while it's hot. I'll just make sure Mr. Hayes is all right." Before they could protest, Victoria was out the kitchen door and heading upstairs. She had not ventured to the upper floor before except to prepare the spare room, and she hesitated briefly at the top of the stairs, unsure which room belonged to Ethan. A muffled sound of movement directed her to a door at the end of the hallway. Victoria approached and knocked softly. "Mr. Hayes, Ethan, are you all right?" she called. There was a pause, then Ethan's voice, rougher than usual. "I'm fine, be down shortly." Victoria wasn't convinced. "May I come in? The men are concerned, and frankly, so am I." Another pause, then a resigned sigh. Doors not locked. Victoria entered to find Ethan sitting on the edge of his bed, shirt unbuttoned and hanging loosely from his good shoulder. His face was flushed, his hair damp with sweat despite the chill in the room. "You're ill," Victoria stated, crossing to him immediately and placing her palm against his forehead. "You're burning with fever." Ethan tried to pull away, but the movement caused him to wince in pain. "It's nothing. Just need to get moving." Victoria fixed him with a stern look. "You're not going anywhere except back into that bed. You've caught a chill from yesterday's adventure in the creek, and your shoulder is clearly worse." Ethan began to protest, but Victoria was already taking charge, helping him out of his shirt to examine his injured shoulder. The bruising had darkened overnight, spreading across his upper back, and the skin was hot to the touch. "This needs attention," Victoria said firmly. "Lie down while I fetch some supplies." To her surprise, Ethan complied, easing himself back against the pillows with a barely suppressed groan. His surrender to her care spoke volumes about how poorly he must be feeling. Victoria hurried downstairs, informing the cowboys of their boss's condition before gathering medical supplies and a basin of cool water. When she returned to Ethan's room, she found him with his eyes closed, his breathing shallow and rapid. "I'm going to place cold compresses on your shoulder and forehead," she explained, wringing out a cloth in the cool water. "It will help bring down the fever." Ethan opened his eyes, watching her with a mixture of discomfort and grudging appreciation as she carefully positioned the compress on his inflamed shoulder. "You don't have to do this," he murmured. "Nonsense." "You'd do the same for any of your men," Victoria replied briskly, placing another compress on his forehead. "Besides, you took us in when you didn't have to. Consider this a partial repayment." As she worked, Victoria became acutely aware of their proximity and the intimacy of her ministrations. Ethan's bedroom was simply furnished but unmistakably masculine, with a rifle mounted on the wall and a desk littered with ranch ledgers. The bed was large and solid, the quilt covering it well-worn but clean. "How's the little one this morning?" Ethan asked, clearly trying to distract himself from his discomfort. "Sleeping soundly when I left her," Victoria replied, refreshing the compress on his forehead. "I should check on her soon, though." "Sam can do that," Ethan said. "He's got 6 of his own back in Ohio." Victoria raised an eyebrow. 6 children? Why is he working on a ranch in Kansas instead of with his family? Ethan's expression darkened slightly. "Wife died 2 years ago. Children are with her parents while he earns enough to bring them west." He paused, then added, "Most men out here are running from something or toward something, sometimes both." Victoria absorbed this, wondering which category Ethan fell into and which she herself occupied. "And you?" she asked quietly, changing the compress again. "What brought you to Kansas?" Ethan was silent for so long that Victoria thought he might not answer. When he did speak, his voice was distant, as if coming from years away. "After the war, I couldn't go back to Virginia. Too many ghosts." He shifted slightly, wincing as the movement jarred his shoulder. "Worked cattle drives for a few years. Hard work, dangerous, but it paid well. Saved enough to buy this place 4 years ago. It's a fine ranch, Victoria said sincerely. Ethan's eyes met hers, fever bright but clear. What about you, Victoria? What are you running from? The direct question caught her off guard. Victoria's hands stilled on the compress and she looked away, unable to meet his penetrating gaze. I told you. My husband died and you're wearing a wedding ring, Ethan interrupted gently, but there's no tan line beneath it. You've not been a married woman recently, if ever. Victoria's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't expected such careful observation from the taciturn rancher. Her carefully constructed story was unraveling before it had even properly taken hold. She began, but a soft knock at the door interrupted her. Sam appeared in the doorway, holding Lily, who was beginning to fuss. Little Miss here was making her presence known, he explained. Thought you might want her. Grateful for the interruption, Victoria took Lily from Sam's arms, cradling her close. Thank you, Sam. Would you ask Joseph to bring up more cool water when he has a moment? Already on it, madam, Sam assured her, casting a concerned glance at Ethan before withdrawing. With Lily in her arms, Victoria felt steadier, more certain of her purpose. She sat in the chair beside Ethan's bed, adjusting Lily so she could continue tending to him with one hand. She has your eyes, Ethan observed, watching them both. Victoria smiled despite her earlier discomfort. Yes, though her father's chin, I think. Ethan didn't press her further about her past, seeming to understand that she needed the refuge of her partial truths for now. Instead, he asked, what will you tell her about him when she's older? The question struck Victoria deeply. She had avoided thinking too far ahead, focused only on keeping Lily safe in the present. I don't know, she admitted softly. The truth, eventually, when she's old enough to understand. Ethan nodded slightly, his eyelids growing heavy as the fever and exhaustion took their toll. Truth's a heavy burden sometimes, he murmured, but lies way more in the end. As he drifted into a restless sleep, Victoria remained beside him, changing the compresses and soothing Lily's occasional fussing. Joseph brought fresh water, and Daniel appeared with a tray of food that Victoria barely touched. The day passed slowly, with Victoria dividing her attention between her patient and her daughter. Ethan's fever rose and fell, sometimes leaving him lucid enough to speak with her, other times plunging him into muttered dreams where he seemed to relive moments from the war. During one such episode, he reached out, gripping Victoria's wrist with surprising strength. Don't let them take the horses, he pleaded, his eyes unfocused. We can't survive without the horses. SHH, Victoria soothed, placing her free hand over his. The horses are safe, Ethan. Everything is safe. He relaxed at her words, his grip loosening as he slipped back into sleep. Victoria gently disentangled herself and continued her vigil, her heart aching for the pain he had endured. By evening, Ethan's fever began to abate, and his sleep grew more peaceful. Victoria had sent Lily with Martha Cooper, who had arrived unexpectedly with food from town, having heard about Ethan's illness through Belmont's efficient gossip network. You should rest, dear, Martha urged when she returned for Lily. You look exhausted. I will, Victoria promised. Once I'm certain he's through the worst of it. Martha gave her a knowing look but didn't press further. I've left stew warming on the stove for the men. They're managing the ranch chores quite capably, so don't you worry about that. After Martha had gone, Victoria sat in the growing darkness of Ethan's room, watching the rise and fall of his chest. She had lit a single lamp, keeping it turned low to avoid disturbing him. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and stars were beginning to appear in the clearing sky. You're still here. Ethan's voice, clearer than it had been all day, startled her from her thoughts. Of course, Victoria replied, leaning forward to check his forehead. It was cooler, the fever having broken at last. How do you feel? Like I was trampled by a herd of buffalo, he admitted with a weak smile. But better. You gave us all quite a scare, Victoria chided gently. The next time you decide to rescue a calf from a flooded creek, perhaps wear a warmer coat. Ethan's smile widened slightly. I'll keep that in mind. He studied her face in the lamplight. You look tired, you should get some sleep. I will now that your fever has broken. Victoria rose, stretching her stiff back. Can I bring you anything before I go? Water, food? Just tell the boys I'll be up tomorrow, Ethan said, attempting to sit up and immediately grimacing in pain. Victoria pressed him gently back onto the pillows. You most certainly will not. That shoulder needs rest and your body needs time to recover from the fever. Ethan frowned. Ranch won't run itself. The ranch will survive a few days without you, Victoria insisted. Sam seems quite capable of managing in your absence. Ethan's expression suggested he wanted to argue, but fatigue won out. One day, he conceded grudgingly, I'll stay abed one day. Victoria smiled triumphantly. We'll see about that. She gathered her things, preparing to leave. I'll check on you in the morning, try to rest. At the door, she paused, looking back at the man who had so unexpectedly become important to her in such a short time. Thank you, Ethan, she said softly. For what? He asked, puzzlement creasing his brow. For everything. For taking us in, for giving us a chance. Victoria hesitated, then added, There aren't many men who would have done what you did. Ethan's expression softened. Get some rest, Victoria. You and Lily both. As Victoria made her way back to the cabin with Lily sleeping soundly in her arms, she felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. Despite the uncertainties that still clouded her future, for the first time in months, she felt she might have found a place where she and Lily could belong. The next few days established a new rhythm at the Hayes Ranch. Ethan, despite his protests, remained largely confined to the house while his shoulder healed. Though he insisted on reviewing ranch accounts and giving instructions to his men from the parlor where Victoria had set up a comfortable convalescent area for him. Victoria divided her time between her duties as housekeeper, caring for Lily, and ensuring Ethan didn't overtax himself during his recovery. The cowboys, initially awkward around her, soon grew comfortable with her presence, especially when they discovered her willingness to darn their socks and add extra portions to their plates. A week after the storm, Ethan was sufficiently recovered to resume limited duties outside, though Victoria watched him like a hawk for signs of fatigue or pain. Her vigilance didn't go unnoticed. You're worse than my mother was, Ethan complained good-naturedly one evening as Victoria examined his shoulder after supper. And she was a fearsome woman when it came to nursing the sick. I'll take that as a compliment, Victoria replied, satisfied that the bruising had faded to a dull yellow. Your mother must have been a wise woman. She was. Something in Ethan's tone made Victoria look up, catching a fleeting sadness in his eyes before he masked it. You remind me of her sometimes. She had the same way of taking charge when things needed doing. Victoria felt oddly touched by the comparison. Tell me about her, she invited, settling into the chair opposite him in the parlor. Lily was already asleep in her basket nearby, her tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. Ethan seemed surprised by the request but began slowly, describing a strong-willed Virginia woman who had managed a prosperous farm with grace and determination until the war had taken everything. She died during the second year of fighting, he said, his voice dropping. Fever took her and my younger sister both. I was away with Lee's army when it happened. I'm so sorry, Victoria said softly, understanding anew the shadows that sometimes darkened his gaze. Ethan nodded his acceptance of her sympathy, then asked, What about your mother? Is she still living? No, Victoria replied, her hands folding in her lap. She died when I was 16. My father followed 3 years later, so you were alone when... Ethan hesitated, clearly not wanting to press too hard on what he sensed was a painful subject. When I met Lily's father, Victoria finished for him, deciding to offer a small piece of truth. Yes, I was alone. Perhaps that's why I was so easily. She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Ethan studied her face, his expression compassionate but not pitying, easily misled. He suggested gently. Victoria nodded, grateful for his understanding. He was charming, sophisticated, everything a young woman with romantic notions might dream of. She smiled ruefully. I was very naive. And now, Ethan asked quietly. Now I trust in what I can see with my own eyes and touch with my own hands, Victoria answered. Promises are just words unless backed by actions. Ethan considered this. That's a hard way to live. It's the only way I know how to keep Lily safe, Victoria said, her gaze drifting to her sleeping daughter. They sat in companionable silence for a time, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. Victoria realized with some surprise how comfortable she had become in Ethan's presence. There was an ease between them that she had never experienced with any man, not even Lily's father in the early days of their acquaintance. "The Harvest Festival is next weekend in town," Ethan mentioned, breaking the silence. "It's a tradition in Belmont, dancing, food, games for the children. The whole county turns out for it." Victoria looked up, catching something like hesitation in his expression. "It sounds lovely." "I thought that is, if you'd like, you and Lily might enjoy attending," Ethan continued, his usual confidence seeming to desert him. "It would be a chance for you to meet more folks from town, make some acquaintances." "That's very thoughtful," Victoria replied, genuinely touched by his consideration. "But wouldn't my presence raise questions? A strange woman and child suddenly appearing at your side might start rumors." Ethan's lips quirked in a half-smile. "Those started the moment I rode into town with you on my horse, Victoria. Small towns run on gossip like engines run on coal." Victoria flushed, realizing the truth of his words. "What are they saying?" she asked, both dreading and needing to know. "Nothing harmful," Ethan assured her. "Most folks know I've been without a housekeeper since Mrs. Abernathy left. They're just curious about you and Lily." Victoria wasn't entirely convinced. She had experienced firsthand how quickly curiosity could turn to judgment where an unmarried woman with a child was concerned. "I don't want to cause problems for you," she said carefully. Ethan leaned forward, his expression earnest. "You're causing no problems. You've been a blessing to this house." He hesitated, then added, "to me." The simple statement hung in the air between them, weighted with meanings neither was ready to fully explore. Victoria felt a warmth spread through her chest, a tentative happiness she scarcely dared acknowledge. "Then we would be honored to accompany you to the festival," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Ethan's smile was like sunrise after a long night. "Good, that's good." He stood, his movements careful but much improved from a week earlier. "I should turn in. Morning comes early." At the parlor doorway, he paused, looking back at Victoria still seated by the fire. "Good night, Victoria." "Good night, Ethan," she replied softly. After he had gone upstairs, Victoria remained by the fire, watching the flames dance and contemplating the unexpected turn her life had taken. A month ago, she had been living in constant fear, planning her escape from a situation that had become increasingly dangerous. Now she was preparing to attend a town festival with a man who looked at her as if she were something precious rather than a possession to be controlled. The thought of the festival brought both anticipation and anxiety. It would be her first real introduction to the community, and first impressions mattered greatly in small towns. She would need a dress nicer than the serviceable garments she currently owned, something that would help her appear respectable and worthy of the position Ethan had given her. With Lily still sleeping peacefully, Victoria retrieved her carpetbag from the cabin and examined its contents. At the bottom, carefully wrapped in tissue, was a dress she had brought from St. Louis, a simple but elegant blue gown with lace at the collar and cuffs. She had packed it on impulse, a reminder of happier times before everything had changed. The dress would need pressing, but it would serve well for the festival. Victoria held it against herself, wondering what Ethan would think when he saw her in something other than her plain work dresses. The thought brought a blush to her cheeks and a flutter to her stomach that she hadn't felt in years, a girlish excitement that both delighted and frightened her. She was growing fond of Ethan Hayes, perhaps too fond for her own safety. "Be careful, Victoria," she whispered to herself, folding the dress carefully away. "Remember what happens when you trust too easily." But as she gathered Lily and prepared to return to their cabin for the night, Victoria couldn't help but feel that perhaps, just perhaps, she had found a man worthy of her trust after all. The following Saturday dawned clear and crisp, the perfect autumn day for Belmont's Harvest Festival. Victoria had risen early, completing her chores with efficient haste before returning to the cabin to prepare herself and Lily for the day's events. The blue dress, freshly pressed and looking better than Victoria had dared hope, complemented her fair complexion and brought out the deep blue of her eyes. She had arranged her hair more carefully than usual, securing the chestnut waves in a simple but elegant style that made her look younger than her 23 years. For Lily, Victoria had created a tiny dress from one of her own worn petticoats, embellishing it with bits of ribbon saved from her sewing basket. The result was charming, and Lily cooed happily as Victoria dressed her in the new finery. "Don't you look beautiful?" Victoria murmured, kissing Lily's plump cheek. "All the ladies in town will be quite jealous of your pretty dress." A knock at the cabin door interrupted her preparations. Victoria opened it to find Ethan standing on the threshold, hat in hand. He had clearly made an effort with his own appearance, wearing a clean white shirt beneath a well-tailored dark vest. His usually unruly hair was neatly combed and his face freshly shaved. "Good morning," he greeted, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her appearance. "You look." The dress is very becoming." Victoria smiled, pleased by his evident admiration. "Thank you, you look quite handsome yourself." A touch of color appeared on Ethan's tanned cheeks. "Thought we might take the buggy instead of the wagon, more comfortable for you and Lily." "That's very thoughtful," Victoria replied, gathering Lily and the small bundle of supplies she'd prepared for the day. Ethan stepped forward to take the bundle, his fingers brushing against hers in the process. The brief contact sent a curious warmth up Victoria's arm, and she quickly busied herself with adjusting Lily's bonnet to hide her reaction. The drive to Belmont was pleasant, the autumn countryside resplendent in golds and crimsons. Ethan pointed out landmarks along the way, sharing stories about the area's early settlement and the challenges the first pioneers had faced. "My grandfather came west in '32, he explained. Said the land called to him in a way Virginia never did. My father thought him mad until he visited himself and felt the same pull." "And you?" Victoria asked, genuinely curious. "Did you feel that pull when you first came here?" Ethan considered the question seriously. "Not at first," he admitted. "When I bought the ranch, I was just looking for somewhere quiet to lick my wounds, somewhere far from battlefields and prison camps." He glanced at her, a smile softening the grimness of his recollection. "But the land has a way of getting under your skin. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else." As they approached Belmont, Victoria could see the town was transformed for the festival. Colorful bunting decorated the storefronts, and a large area near the church had been cleared for dancing. Tables laden with food lined one side of the square, and children darted about playing games while their parents socialized. Ethan helped Victoria down from the buggy, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. The warmth in his eyes as he looked at her made Victoria's heart beat faster, and she found herself hoping the day would be a success, not just for her integration into the community, but for what it might mean for her growing relationship with Ethan. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Conversations paused briefly as curious eyes took in the unfamiliar woman and child accompanying Ethan Hayes. Victoria straightened her shoulders, determined to face the scrutiny with dignity. Martha Cooper was the first to approach them, her friendly face a welcome sight amid the sea of strangers. "Ethan Hayes, it's about time you brought Mrs. Parker to town," she exclaimed, embracing Victoria warmly. "And this must be little Lily. My, isn't she growing beautifully?" Martha's easy acceptance set the tone for many of the introductions that followed. Victoria found herself warmly welcomed by most of the townspeople, particularly the women who were delighted to meet the person responsible for civilizing Ethan's bachelor household. "That man needed a woman's touch in that house for years," confided Mrs. Peterson, the minister's wife. Mrs. Abernathy did her best, bless her, but she was getting on in years. "It's good to see a younger woman taking charge." Victoria smiled politely, though she noted the speculative gleam in the older woman's eye. Clearly, Mrs. Peterson was among those wondering if Victoria's position might evolve into something more permanent than housekeeper. Throughout the morning, Victoria was aware of Ethan's protective presence nearby, even when they weren't directly together. He seemed to have an uncanny sense of when she might need rescuing from an overly curious interrogator, or when Lily's fussing required a quiet moment away from the crowd. By midday, Victoria was feeling more relaxed, having survived the initial wave of introductions with her dignity intact. She sat with Lily under the shade of an old oak tree, watching as children competed in sack races and adults chatted in small groups. "Surviving so far?" Ethan asked, joining her with 2 plates of food from the communal table. "Better than I expected," Victoria admitted, accepting the offered plate gratefully. "Your neighbors have been most welcoming." "Told you they would be," Ethan replied, settling beside her on the blanket they'd spread earlier. "Belmont folks are good people once you get past their natural curiosity." They ate in companionable silence, watching the festival activities unfold around them. Lily, who had been passed from admiring arms to admiring arms throughout the morning, was now sleeping peacefully in her basket, exhausted by all the attention. "The dancing will start soon," Ethan mentioned, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "Would you?" "That is, if you'd like to dance, I'd be honored to partner you." Victoria looked at him in surprise. Somehow she hadn't pictured the taciturn rancher as a dancer. "I'd enjoy that very much," she replied, "though I haven't danced in quite some time. I may be rather rusty." "Makes 2 of us," Ethan said with a self-deprecating smile. "But I reckon we can manage not to trample each other's feet too badly." The musicians, a local quartet with fiddles and a piano brought outdoors for the occasion, began tuning their instruments. People started gathering around the cleared area, anticipation evident in their movements and conversations. Martha Cooper appeared at that moment, her timing suspiciously convenient. "I'll watch the little angel while you 2 young people enjoy the dancing," she offered, settling herself comfortably on the blanket beside Lily's basket. Before Victoria could protest that she was hardly a young person, at 23, Ethan had risen and extended his hand to her. With a mixture of nervousness and excitement, Victoria allowed him to lead her to the dance floor. The musicians struck up a lively reel, and couples formed lines facing each other. Victoria found herself swept into the pattern of the dance, her initial awkwardness fading as she followed Ethan's surprisingly confident lead. He moved with the same fluid grace he displayed on horseback, his large hands gentle but secure as they guided her through the steps. "You dance very well for a man who claims to be rusty," Victoria observed breathlessly as they came together briefly in the pattern of the dance. Ethan's eyes crinkled at the corners. "My mother insisted all her children learn properly, said it was the mark of a gentleman." "She was right," Victoria replied, enjoying the way his hand felt at her waist as he turned her. They danced 3 sets together, stopping only when the musicians paused for a rest. Flushed and laughing, Victoria followed Ethan to the refreshment table where he procured cups of cool cider for them both. "You look happy," Ethan remarked, studying her animated face. "It suits you." Victoria smiled up at him, realizing that she was indeed happier than she had been in a very long time. "I am happy," she admitted. "Happier than I thought possible a few months ago." Something flickered in Ethan's eyes, a warmth and longing that made Victoria's breath catch. For a moment she thought he might say something more, but they were interrupted by Harold Cooper approaching with a portly, well-dressed man Victoria hadn't met yet. "Ethan, there you are," Harold called. "Judge Wilson has been asking after you, says he has a proposition you might be interested in." Ethan's expression shifted subtly, becoming more guarded as he turned to greet the newcomers. "Judge Wilson, good to see you. This is Mrs. Parker, my housekeeper. Victoria, this is Judge Wilson, county magistrate and owner of the largest cattle operation in the region." The judge, a florid-faced man with shrewd eyes, bowed slightly to Victoria before turning his attention back to Ethan. "Hayes, I've been meaning to discuss that north section of your property. My foreman thinks it would make an excellent addition to our grazing lands." Victoria could sense Ethan's immediate resistance to the idea, though his face remained politely neutral. "I'm not looking to sell, Judge. As I've mentioned before," the older man waved a dismissive hand. Everyone has a price, Hayes. I'm prepared to be generous. Not today, Judge, Ethan replied firmly. Today is for celebrating the harvest, not business. Judge Wilson's smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course, but do consider my offer. It would be the sensible choice, especially for a man in your position. Something in the way he emphasized your position made Victoria uneasy. There was an undercurrent to the conversation she didn't understand but could sense was significant. After the judge and Harold had moved on, Victoria asked quietly, "What did he mean by your position?" Ethan's jaw tightened. Nothing worth discussing on a day like today. He visibly made an effort to relax, offering her a smile that didn't quite erase the tension around his eyes. "Shall we check on Lily, then perhaps another dance before we head home?" Victoria allowed the subject change, though her curiosity remained. There was clearly some history between Ethan and the judge that went beyond a simple land dispute. They found Martha dozing beside Lily's basket, the older woman startling awake as they approached. "Oh my, did I nod off?" "The little angel has been perfect, not a peep." Victoria thanked Martha for her help, gathering Lily, who was beginning to stir. As she cradled her daughter, Victoria noticed Ethan watching them with an expression of such tenderness that it made her heart ache with a curious mixture of joy and fear. Joy at the thought that this good, honorable man might care for them both. Fear that such happiness could not possibly last, that her past would eventually destroy this fragile new beginning. The musicians began playing again, this time a slower waltz. Ethan glanced at Victoria, then at Lily in her arms. "I believe this dance might accommodate 3, he said softly, stepping closer and placing one hand lightly at Victoria's waist, the other gently supporting her arm that held Lily. And so they danced, the 3 of them together, moving slowly at the edge of the dance floor. Victoria could feel the warmth of Ethan's body, solid and reassuring against her side, while Lily gazed up at them both with wide, curious eyes. In that moment, they must have looked like a family to anyone watching. The thought brought an unexpected lump to Victoria's throat and a dangerous hope to her heart. As the afternoon waned and families began preparing to leave, Victoria noticed Ethan glancing frequently toward the west, where dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. "Another storm coming?" she asked, following his gaze. Ethan nodded. "We should head back before it hits." "Looks to be moving fast." They said their goodbyes, Victoria touched by the genuine invitations from several of the women to call on them in town. Martha Cooper insisted on sending them home with a basket of her prize-winning apple preserves, and even Mrs. Peterson, for all her earlier speculation, warmly clasped Victoria's hands and expressed her hope that they would attend Sunday services soon. The journey home was more subdued than their morning ride. Both Victoria and Ethan lost in their own thoughts as the buggy rolled steadily toward the ranch. The wind was rising, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of another autumn storm. They were within sight of the ranch when the first heavy drops began to fall. Ethan urged the horse to a faster pace, but by the time they reached the yard, the rain was coming down in sheets. "Make a run for the house," Ethan shouted over the downpour, helping Victoria down from the buggy. "I'll see to the horse and join you." Victoria gathered Lily close, protecting her as best she could with her shawl, and dashed for the porch. Even that short distance left her soaked, her carefully arranged hair plastered to her head and her beautiful blue dress clinging to her form. Inside, she quickly removed Lily's wet bonnet and outer garments, relieved to find the baby relatively dry and unperturbed by their mad dash through the rain. Victoria, however, was drenched, water pooling around her feet on the entryway floor. She had just settled Lily in a chair cushioned with pillows when Ethan burst through the door, equally soaked and carrying their bundles from the buggy. His white shirt was transparent with moisture, clinging to the broad planes of his chest and revealing the strong contours of his shoulders. Victoria became suddenly acutely aware of her own wet dress molded to her body, and heat rushed to her cheeks as Ethan's gaze swept over her. His eyes darkened, and for a breathless moment neither of them moved. "You're soaked through," Ethan said finally, his voice rougher than usual. You should change before you catch a chill. Yes, Victoria agreed, unable to look away from him. So should you. Another moment of charged silence stretched between them, broken only when a clap of thunder startled them both. Lily whimpered at the sound, and Victoria moved quickly to comfort her, grateful for the distraction. "I'll light the stove," Ethan said, visibly collecting himself. "Get some heat in here." Victoria nodded, gathering Lily and their things. "I'll change at the cabin and come back to prepare supper." "Take your time," Ethan replied, running a hand through his wet hair. "The boys won't be back from town till late. It's just us tonight, just us." The simple phrase hung in the air, filled with unspoken possibilities that both thrilled and terrified Victoria. At the cabin, she changed into a dry dress and attended to Lily's needs, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The day had been wonderful, better than she could have hoped. The townspeople had been welcoming, Lily had charmed everyone she met, and Ethan. Ethan had looked at her as if she were the sunrise after an endless night. By the time Victoria returned to the main house, carrying Lily and a small bundle of dry clothes, the storm was raging in earnest. Wind howled around the eaves and rain lashed against the windows. Inside, however, was warm and welcoming, with lamps lit against the premature darkness and the stove radiating heat throughout the kitchen. Ethan had changed into dry clothes and was attempting to start a fire in the parlor fireplace when Victoria entered. He looked up at her approach, his expression softening at the sight of her and Lily. "Didn't expect you back so quickly in this weather," he said, rising from his crouch by the hearth. "I thought you might be hungry," Victoria replied, setting Lily's basket in its usual spot near the kitchen table. "And the cabin gets rather drafty during storms." "You're welcome here anytime," Ethan said simply, "storm or no storm." Victoria busied herself with supper preparations, grateful for the familiar tasks to occupy her hands while her mind and heart were in such turmoil. She was falling in love with Ethan Hayes, had perhaps already fallen, and the realization was both wonderful and terrifying. They ate by lamplight as the storm raged outside, their conversation flowing easily from topic to topic. Ethan described his plans for expanding the horse breeding side of his operation, while Victoria shared stories from her childhood in St. Louis. It felt natural, comfortable, as if they had known each other for years rather than weeks. After the meal, they moved to the parlor where Ethan had finally coaxed a cheerful fire to life. Victoria settled in a chair with Lily, who was fighting sleep despite the lateness of the hour, too stimulated by the day's events and the ongoing thunder. "She's got your stubbornness," Ethan observed, watching as Lily struggled against her drooping eyelids. Victoria laughed softly. "I prefer to call it determination." "Same thing, different word," Ethan replied with a smile, settling into the chair opposite her. His expression grew more serious as he studied her face in the firelight. "Victoria, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Victoria's heart skipped a beat, both anticipating and dreading what might follow. "Yes," Ethan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. "How long do you plan to stay? At the ranch, I mean." The question wasn't what Victoria had expected, though she realized it was a practical concern. "I hadn't thought much beyond the immediate future," she admitted. "When you hired me, we didn't discuss a specific term of employment." "It wasn't just employment I was offering," Ethan said quietly. "It was a home for both of you." Victoria's throat tightened with emotion. "We've been very happy here," she managed to say. "I'm glad." Ethan hesitated, then continued, "Because I'd like you to consider making it permanent." Victoria stared at him, scarcely daring to breathe. "Permanent?" Ethan stood, too restless to remain seated, and moved to stand before the fire. "I know it hasn't been long, too short a time for what I'm asking, perhaps, but I feel like I've known you much longer." He turned to face her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "I care for you, Victoria, for you and Lily both." Victoria clutched Lily closer, her heart pounding so hard she was certain Ethan must hear it over the storm. "Ethan, you don't have to answer now," he interrupted quickly. "I know you have reservations, things in your past you're not ready to share. I understand that. I have my own ghosts." He took a deep breath. All I'm asking is that you consider the possibility of a future here, with me." The sincerity in his voice, the earnest hope in his eyes, nearly undid Victoria completely. She wanted nothing more than to accept what he was offering: a home, security, the chance for Lily to grow up loved and protected. And for herself, the possibility of a love far truer than anything she had known before, but the shadows of her past loomed large in her mind. If Ethan knew the truth, all of it, would he still look at her with such tenderness? Or would his warmth turn to disgust, his welcome to rejection? "You deserve an honest answer," Victoria said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "And for that, I need to tell you the truth about why I came to Belmont." Ethan nodded, returning to his chair but sitting forward attentively. "I'm listening." Victoria took a deep breath, gathering her courage. The story she was about to tell had never passed her lips before, the secret she had guarded so carefully about to be revealed to the man whose good opinion had become vitally important to her. "My husband is not dead," she began, her voice steadier than she expected. "At least, not that I know of. His name is James Blackwell, and he is one of the most respected businessmen in St. Louis and one of the cruelest men I have ever known." Ethan's expression remained neutral, though his eyes never left her face as Victoria continued her tale. She described meeting James when she was barely 18, dazzled by his charm and the luxurious lifestyle he offered the orphaned daughter of a modestly successful merchant. "The first year of our marriage was tolerable," Victoria explained, her gaze fixed on Lily's sleeping face rather than Ethan's. "James was controlling, possessive, but not physically violent. That came later, after I discovered the true nature of some of his business dealings." She described how James had used her father's good name and business connections to establish himself in certain social circles, only to exploit those relationships for illegal gain. When Victoria had confronted him, his charming facade had crumbled, revealing the monster beneath. "The first time he struck me, I told myself it was an aberration," Victoria said, her voice hollow with remembered pain. "By the third time, I knew it was who he truly was." Ethan's hands had clenched into fists as she spoke, but he remained silent, allowing her to tell her story without interruption. "When I discovered I was carrying Lily, I knew I had to leave," Victoria continued. "I couldn't bear the thought of raising a child in that house, watching my daughter grow up in fear as I had." She looked up at Ethan, needing him to understand. "It took me months to plan our escape. James watched me constantly, controlled every aspect of my life, my friends, my activities, even the money I could access." "How did you manage it?" Ethan asked quietly, his voice tight with suppressed anger. Not at her, Victoria realized with relief, but on her behalf. "His mother died," Victoria explained. "He had to travel to Chicago for the funeral. It gave me 3 days. I had been secretly saving what little money I could for months and had hidden it in a book. He would never open a volume of poetry he considered frivolous." A bitter smile crossed her lips. "James never appreciated anything beautiful unless it reflected well on him." She described how she had packed only what she could carry, taken the small amount of money she had saved, and fled west on the first train out of St. Louis, eventually making her way to Kansas in a series of short journeys designed to confuse anyone who might follow. The stagecoach driver was the last in a chain of paid transportations, Victoria finished. "My money ran out just as we reached Belmont, which is why he left us at the edge of town." She looked up at Ethan, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "And then you found us." Silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. Victoria waited, her heart in her throat, for Ethan's reaction to her confession. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but serious. "Do you believe he's looking for you?" Victoria nodded. "James doesn't forgive betrayal as he would see it. More importantly, he sees Lily as his property, an extension of himself. He would never allow his child to be raised by anyone else. Has he connections in this region, friends or business associates who might recognize you?" Ethan asked, his mind clearly working through the practical implications of her revelation. "I don't believe so," Victoria replied, His business interests were primarily in the east. It's why I headed west. Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. Then he rose and crossed to kneel before her chair, taking one of her hands in his much larger ones. Victoria, nothing you've told me changes how I feel about you and Lily. If anything, knowing what you've overcome only increases my admiration for your courage and strength. Victoria stared at him, hardly daring to believe his acceptance. But I lied to you. I'm still legally married to another man. You did what you had to do to protect yourself and your child, Ethan interrupted firmly. There's no shame in that. He gently touched Lily's sleeping cheek with one finger, his expression softening. This little one deserves a safe home, and so do you. I meant what I said before. I want you both to stay permanently. As your housekeeper, Victoria asked, needing clarity despite the hope blooming in her chest. Ethan's eyes met hers, their blue depths sincere and unwavering. As whatever you're comfortable being, my housekeeper, my friend, my. He hesitated, then finished simply, my family. The word hung between them, filled with promise and possibility. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of relief and tentative happiness rather than sorrow. I can't make promises, she said softly. Not while James is still a threat, however distant. It wouldn't be fair to you. I'm not asking for promises, Ethan replied. Just a chance to prove that not all men are like James Blackwell, a chance to show you and Lily what a real home can be. Victoria looked down at their joined hands, then back up to Ethan's earnest face. I would like that very much, she whispered. Ethan's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Then it's settled, you'll stay. As if to punctuate his words, a particularly loud clap of thunder shook the house, causing Lily to startle awake with a frightened cry. Victoria immediately moved to comfort her, but Ethan was already reaching for the baby. May I? He asked, his large hands surprisingly gentle as Victoria transferred Lily to his arms. Ethan cradled Lily against his chest, his deep voice rumbling soothingly as he moved to the window. That's just the sky talking, little one. Nothing to fear while you're safe inside. Victoria watched as Ethan paced slowly with Lily, pointing out the flashes of lightning and explaining in simple terms how storms worked. Lily's cries gradually subsided, her tiny hand clutching Ethan's finger as her eyes, so like Victoria's own, gazed trustingly up at him. The sight of them together, this strong, gentle man and her precious daughter, filled Victoria with a sense of rightness and belonging she had never expected to feel again. For the first time since fleeing St. Louis, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps they had truly found a home at last. As autumn deepened toward winter, life at the Hayes Ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. Victoria's role evolved beyond mere housekeeper as she gradually took on more responsibilities, helping with the ranch accounts and offering suggestions for improvements to the house and grounds that Ethan invariably implemented. Their relationship, too, evolved slowly but steadily. Ethan was careful never to push beyond what Victoria was comfortable with, respecting the boundaries imposed by her past experiences and legal situation. His courtship, for that was what it had become, was conducted with old-fashioned restraint and genuine tenderness that gradually rebuilt Victoria's trust in masculine affection. For Lily's part, she thrived in the stable, loving environment. Now 7 months old, she was becoming more active and responsive every day, delighting in the attention lavished on her not only by Victoria and Ethan, but by the Cowboys as well. Even gruff Sam had been caught making silly faces to coax a smile from her, though he pretended great dignity whenever Victoria noticed. One crisp November morning, Victoria was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when Ethan entered, his expression more serious than usual. "Morning," he greeted, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. "I need to ride into town today, some business with the bank that can't be put off any longer." "Of course," Victoria replied, noting the tension in his shoulders. "Is everything all right?" Ethan hesitated, clearly debating how much to share. "Just some financial matters that need attention, nothing for you to worry about." Victoria raised an eyebrow. After all these weeks, I would have thought you'd know I prefer honesty to protection, Ethan. Ethan had the grace to look chastened. You're right, I'm sorry, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. The truth is, the ranch is facing some difficulties. The price of cattle has dropped, and I expanded too quickly last spring, buying breeding stock that stretched my resources thin. Victoria nodded, appreciating his candor. Is there anything I can do to help? Actually, there is, Ethan said, looking relieved at her practical response. I've noticed you have a good head for figures. Would you mind looking over the accounts while I'm in town? You might spot something I've missed. I'd be happy to, Victoria replied, touched by his trust in her abilities. My father taught me bookkeeping for his business from the time I was old enough to add and subtract. Ethan's smile warmed her as it always did. I thought as much. You have that look when you're balancing the household ledger like you're solving a puzzle that's challenging but not impossible. The fact that he had noticed such a detail about her was both surprising and gratifying. Victoria found herself blushing slightly as she turned back to the stove, conscious of his gaze following her movements. After breakfast, Ethan showed Victoria his account books before heading to town, explaining his system of record keeping and highlighting the areas of most concern. Victoria listened attentively, already forming ideas about potential economies and efficiencies. Once Ethan had departed and Lily was settled for her morning nap, Victoria immersed herself in the ranch accounts. Hours passed as she pored over the figures, making notes and calculations on a separate sheet of paper. What emerged was concerning but not dire. Ethan had been correct about the impact of falling cattle prices and his perhaps over-ambitious expansion. However, Victoria also noted that the horse breeding operation, while smaller, showed a consistently higher profit margin. Furthermore, several of the mares Ethan had purchased were of excellent bloodlines that promised valuable foals in the spring. She was still working when Ethan returned in the late afternoon, his expression grim as he entered the study where she had established herself. That bad? Victoria asked, looking up from her notes. Ethan removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of frustration. Bank's calling in a portion of my loan. Judge Wilson sits on the board of directors and has been suggesting the ranch might not be a safe investment. Victoria frowned. The same Judge Wilson who wants to buy your north section, one and the same, Ethan confirmed, his jaw tight with anger. He's been trying to piece together a larger holding for years. My refusal to sell has been a thorn in his side. So he's applying pressure through the bank, Victoria concluded, understanding now the tension she had observed between the two men at the harvest festival. Ethan nodded, coming to stand beside her at the desk. What have you found here? Victoria showed him her analysis, explaining her observations about the relative profitability of the cattle versus horse operations. If you shifted your focus more toward breeding horses, particularly using the bloodlines of those new mares, you might weather this difficult period more successfully. Ethan studied her notes, his expression gradually lightening. This is excellent work, Victoria. I had similar thoughts about the horses but hadn't run the figures so thoroughly. He looked at her with open admiration. You have a real talent for this. Victoria felt a warm glow of pride at his praise. My father always said I had a merchant's mind in a lady's body. He meant it as a compliment, though my mother was less certain. Ethan chuckled, then grew serious again. This helps, but it doesn't solve the immediate problem. The bank wants $500 by the end of the month, or they'll foreclose on a portion of my grazing land, the north section. Coincidentally enough. Victoria's mind worked rapidly, considering possibilities. What about selling one or two of the less promising cattle to raise quick cash? Or perhaps some of the horses that aren't central to your breeding program, already planning to, Ethan confirmed. But cattle prices are down, as we discussed, and good horses take time to sell for their proper value. I might need to make a trip to Topeka or even Kansas City to find buyers willing to pay what they're worth. Then that's what you should do, Victoria said decisively. I can manage things here with the boys' help for a few days. Ethan studied her face, his expression softening. "You're remarkable, do you know that? Most women would be in a panic at the thought of financial troubles." "I'm not most women," Victoria replied with a small smile. "Besides, I've faced worse than money problems and survived." Ethan reached out, taking her hand in his. "Yes, you have. And we'll survive this too, together." The simple declaration, with its implication of a shared future, warmed Victoria to her core. She squeezed his hand in silent agreement. The following week was a flurry of activity as Ethan prepared for his journey to Kansas City. He selected 4 of his best horses to sell, including a handsome stallion that Victoria knew he was particularly proud of. "Are you sure about Thunderbolt?" she asked as they reviewed his selections. "I know how much he means to you." Ethan's expression was resigned but determined. "He'll fetch the best price, and I still have his sire and several of his offspring. It's a sacrifice worth making if it secures the ranch's future." The night before Ethan's departure, after Lily had been put to bed in the cabin, Victoria found herself unable to sleep. The thought of Ethan traveling so far, carrying such valuable horses and potentially returning with a substantial sum of money, filled her with anxiety. She was sitting by the cabin's small stove, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the November chill, when a soft knock sounded at the door. Puzzled by a visitor at such a late hour, Victoria approached cautiously. "Who is it?" she called. "It's me," Ethan's deep voice replied. Victoria quickly opened the door to find Ethan standing on the threshold, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "Is something wrong?" she asked, stepping back to allow him entry. "No, nothing's wrong. He hesitated, then continued, "I couldn't sleep and I saw your light was still on." Victoria gestured to the small table where a single lamp burned low. "I couldn't sleep either, too many thoughts." Ethan nodded in understanding, removing his hat and holding it awkwardly in his hands. "I wanted to speak with you before I left, away from the bustle of preparations." "Of course," Victoria replied, suddenly nervous though she couldn't have explained why. "Please sit down." Ethan settled into one of the 2 chairs at the table while Victoria took the other. In the small cabin, their knees nearly touched in the confined space, creating an intimacy that made Victoria's heart beat faster. "Victoria," Ethan began, his voice softer than usual, "I want you to know that whatever happens with the bank, with Judge Wilson, with any of it, my feelings for you and Lily haven't changed. If anything, they've only grown stronger these past weeks." Victoria's breath caught in her throat at the earnest declaration. "Ethan, please, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "I know your situation is complicated. I know there are legal barriers to what I really want to ask you, but I need you to understand that when those barriers are removed, whether through divorce or—" He hesitated, then continued carefully, "or through other means, my intentions toward you are entirely honorable." Victoria understood what he was saying and what he was carefully not saying. In the eyes of the law, she was still married to James Blackwell. Unless she could obtain a divorce difficult and scandalous for a woman in her position, or unless James died, she could not legally marry again. "I understand," she said softly, reaching across the table to take his hand. "And I want you to know that I share your feelings, Ethan. What you've given us, a home, safety, respect, means more than I can express." Ethan turned his hand to clasp hers, his calloused palm warm against her smaller one. "It's selfish of me to speak of this now, before I've resolved the ranch's financial troubles, but I couldn't leave without telling you what's in my heart." "It's not selfish," Victoria assured him, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "It gives me hope, and hope is something I've been short of for too long." Ethan's eyes, so blue and honest in the lamplight, held her steadily. "When I return, successful or not, we'll face whatever comes together. That's my promise to you." "And I promise to keep your home safe until you return," Victoria replied, meaning far more than the physical structure of the house. Ethan lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm that sent a shiver of warmth through her entire body. Then, with visible reluctance, he released her hand and rose to his feet. "I should go. Morning will come early, and there's much to be done before I leave." Victoria walked him to the door, her heart full of things she wanted to say but couldn't find the words for. At the threshold, Ethan turned to her once more, his expression tender and determined. "Take care of each other," he said simply. "We will," Victoria promised. "And you take care as well, come back to us safely." "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Ethan replied with a small smile, then stepped out into the night. Victoria watched until his figure disappeared into the darkness, then closed the door with a soft sigh. Despite the uncertainty of the ranch's financial situation and the lingering shadow of her past, she felt a surprising sense of peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she and Ethan would face them together. And for now, that was enough. The days following Ethan's departure passed slowly for Victoria, despite her busy schedule managing both household and ranch affairs. She had developed a routine with Lily that allowed her to attend to necessary tasks while still giving her daughter the attention she needed. But Ethan's absence left a noticeable void in their daily lives. The Cowboys continued their work under Sam's capable direction, respecting Victoria's position as Ethan's representative in household matters. Joseph took on the role of reporting to her each evening, keeping her informed of any issues that arose and seeking her input on decisions that would normally have been Ethan's to make. "Boss said to treat your word as his while he's gone," Joseph explained when Victoria expressed surprise at being consulted about a fence repair. "Said you had a good head on your shoulders and we do well to listen to you." Victoria was touched by Ethan's confidence in her, though she was careful to defer to the Cowboys' greater experience in matters of ranch operation. It was a delicate balance, maintaining her authority while acknowledging their expertise, but one she managed with increasing confidence as the days passed. A week after Ethan's departure, Victoria was in the kitchen preparing supper when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Her heart leapt with hope that it might be Ethan returning earlier than expected, but when she glanced out the window, she saw instead Harold Cooper's delivery wagon pulling into the yard. Victoria wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door, curious about this unexpected visit. Harold wasn't due to deliver supplies for another week, and Victoria hadn't placed any special orders. "Afternoon, Mrs. Parker," Harold called, tipping his hat as he climbed down from the wagon. "Brought some things from Martha. She was worried you might be running short with Mr. Hayes away." "That's very thoughtful of her," Victoria replied, helping Harold carry several baskets into the kitchen. "Though we're well stocked thanks to Ethan's preparations before he left." Harold nodded, seemingly unsurprised. "Martha likes to fuss, gives her purpose now that our children are grown." He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "There's also been some talk in town I thought you should know about." Victoria's hands stilled in the act of unpacking a basket of preserves. "What kind of talk?" Harold glanced toward the door, ensuring they were alone. "Judge Wilson's been asking questions about you and the little one. Where you came from, how long you've been with Ethan, that sort of thing." A chill ran through Victoria despite the warmth of the kitchen. What prompted this interest? "Can't say for certain," Harold replied, his kind face concerned. "But it started after Ethan refused to sell that north section again. Judge doesn't like being told no, especially by a man he considers beneath him socially." Victoria considered this information carefully. It could be simple curiosity or spite on the judge's part, using her mysterious appearance as a way to potentially embarrass Ethan. Or it could be something more sinister if by some remote chance James had connections that reached as far as Belmont. "Has anyone responded to his questions?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite her growing unease. Harold shook his head. "Not that I know of. Folks around here respect Ethan too much to gossip about his household, but I thought you should be aware just the same." "Thank you, Harold." "I appreciate your discretion and concern," Victoria said sincerely. After Harold had departed, promising to return in a few days with the regular delivery, Victoria found herself pacing the kitchen, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. The thought that Judge Wilson was investigating her past sent tremors of anxiety through her. What if he somehow discovered her connection to James? What if word got back to St. Louis? Victoria forced herself to calm down, to think rationally. The likelihood of Judge Wilson uncovering her true identity was slim. She had been careful to leave few traces of her journey west, and James, for all his resources, would have little reason to look for her in a small Kansas town. Still, the news left her unsettled and watchful. That night, after putting Lily to bed, Victoria found herself checking the locks on the cabin door more carefully than usual, keeping the small pistol Ethan had insisted she take closer at hand. 2 more days passed without incident. Victoria was beginning to relax her vigilance when, on the morning of the 10th day after Ethan's departure, a strange carriage appeared on the road leading to the ranch. Victoria was hanging laundry in the yard, Lily playing contentedly in a basket nearby, when she spotted the approaching vehicle. It was a fine carriage, more suited to city streets than country roads, drawn by a matched pair of glossy black horses. Even from a distance, Victoria could tell this was no local farmer or tradesman making a casual call. Her first thought was of Judge Wilson, coming to continue his inquiries in person. But as the carriage drew nearer, Victoria realized it was too fine even for the judge, who, while wealthy by local standards, was not given to such ostentatious displays. A cold dread settled in the pit of her stomach, a premonition of danger that made her heart race. Quickly, she gathered Lily and retreated to the house, calling for Sam, who was working in the nearby barn. "Sam," Victoria called, trying to keep the alarm from her voice, "we have visitors." The older cowboy emerged from the barn, squinting toward the approaching carriage. His expression grew wary as he assessed the unexpected arrival. "Don't recognize that rig," he commented, moving to stand protectively near Victoria. "Want me to see who it is?" Victoria nodded, clutching Lily closer. "Yes, please, I'll wait inside." Sam positioned himself near the front porch as the carriage pulled into the yard and came to a stop. Victoria watched from behind the parlor curtains, her breath catching in her throat as the carriage door opened. A tall, elegantly dressed man stepped down, removing his hat to reveal silver-streaked dark hair and aristocratic features that Victoria had hoped never to see again. James Blackwell had found them. Victoria's knees threatened to give way beneath her as shock and terror washed over her in a paralyzing wave. How had he found them? What would he do? Lily sensed her distress and began to fuss, small hands clutching at Victoria's dress. Through the window, Victoria could see Sam speaking with James, gesturing toward the house. James's posture was confident, commanding the stance of a man accustomed to deference and obedience. After a brief exchange, Sam turned toward the house, his expression troubled. Victoria retreated from the window, her mind racing. There was no time to flee, nowhere to hide. James would recognize his own child instantly, and Victoria had no illusions about what would happen if he managed to take Lily from her. The back door opened and Joseph entered the kitchen, freezing at the sight of Victoria's pale face. "Mrs. Parker, everything all right?" "Joseph," Victoria said urgently, "take Lily, go out the back and ride to town as fast as you can. Find Harold Cooper and tell him to send word to Ethan immediately." Joseph's eyes widened at her intensity, but he didn't question her, stepping forward to take Lily from her arms. "What about you, madam?" "I'll be fine," Victoria lied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just keep Lily safe until Ethan returns." Joseph hesitated, clearly torn between his protective instincts and Victoria's direct instruction. "Sam's out front with that fancy gent. Should I tell him something?" "No," Victoria decided quickly. "It's better if you just go, quietly and quickly." Understanding dawned in Joseph's eyes as he grasped the severity of the situation. "Yes, madam. I'll keep her safe, I promise." Victoria pressed a kiss to Lily's forehead, whispering, "Mama loves you," before Joseph whisked her away through the back door. Tears stung Victoria's eyes as she watched them go, but she blinked them away fiercely. She would need all her wits and courage to face James. A knock at the front door signaled that time had run out. Victoria smoothed her dress, straightened her shoulders, and moved to answer it, her hand trembling only slightly as she reached for the latch. Sam stood on the porch, looking uncomfortable, with James Blackwell towering beside him. "Mrs. Parker, Sam began formally, this gentleman says he's an acquaintance of yours from St. Louis, a Mr. Blackwell. Hello, Victoria, James said, his voice as smooth and cultured as she remembered. His dark eyes, so different from Ethan's warm blue gaze, held a coldness that belied his polite smile. It's been a long time. Victoria managed a slight nod, not trusting her voice. Sam glanced between them, clearly sensing the tension but unsure of his role in this unexpected reunion. Would you like me to stay, madam? He asked Victoria, his hand drifting subtly toward the knife at his belt. That won't be necessary, Sam, Victoria replied, finding her voice at last. Mr. Blackwell and I have much to discuss. Thank you for your assistance. Sam hesitated, his loyalty to Ethan warring with Victoria's dismissal. I'll be in the barn if you need anything, he said finally, directing a pointed look at James before reluctantly withdrawing. Victoria stepped back, allowing James to enter the house. He moved past her with the confident stride of a man entering his own domain, his gaze sweeping critically over the simple but comfortable furnishings of Ethan's home. Quite a step down from our home in St. Louis, he commented, removing his gloves with deliberate precision. Though I suppose beggars can't be choosers when they're on the run. Victoria closed the door but remained near it, maintaining as much distance as possible between them. How did you find me? She asked, her voice steadier than she had expected. James smiled, a cold, self-satisfied expression that had once made her tremble. It wasn't as difficult as you might imagine. You left a trail, Victoria, small, yes, but discernible to someone with the resources to follow it. He set his hat and gloves on a side table, making himself at home. A ticket agent in Springfield remembered a woman with a baby matching your description. A hotel clerk in Independence recalled a similar pair. And so on, all the way to a most cooperative stagecoach driver who remembered leaving you at the edge of a small town called Belmont. Victoria's heart sank. She had been careful, but not careful enough. James had always been relentless when he wanted something, and he had resources few could match. What do you want, James? She asked, though she already knew the answer. What belongs to me, he replied simply. My wife. My child, my property. The familiar way he lumped her and Lily together with inanimate possessions fueled a spark of anger that began to burn through Victoria's fear. Lily is not your property, she said fiercely, and neither am I, not anymore. James raised an eyebrow, unperturbed by her defiance. The law disagrees, my dear. A wife belongs to her husband and a child to its father. Your little adventure in Independence doesn't change that fact. He moved further into the room and Victoria circled away, maintaining the distance between them. James noticed a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Still afraid of me, I see. Good, fear breeds respect. He glanced around the parlor again. Where's my daughter? I expected to find her with you. Victoria's heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral. She's not here. James's eyes narrowed dangerously. Don't play games with me, Victoria. Where is she? Safe, Victoria replied, drawing strength from the knowledge that Lily was indeed beyond James's reach for the moment. Away from you. Anger flashed across James's features, the mask of civility slipping momentarily before he regained control. This is tedious and unnecessary. I've come to take you both home where you belong. Your disappearance has caused quite the stir in St. Louis society. People are concerned for your welfare. Concerned for my welfare, Victoria repeated incredulously. The last time I saw you, James, you broke my arm because dinner was served 10 minutes late. Forgive me if I find your concern for my welfare somewhat lacking in sincerity. James waved a dismissive hand. A regrettable loss of temper, nothing more. You always did have a talent for provocation, Victoria. The casual way he dismissed his violence rekindled all the pain and fear Victoria had experienced during their marriage. But now, months away from his influence, she could recognize his tactics for what they were: manipulation designed to make her doubt herself, to accept blame for his cruelty. I'm not returning to St. Louis with you, Victoria stated firmly. Neither is Lily. We have a home here now. James's expression hardened. Yes, I've heard about your home, taking up with a cowboy, playing at being a frontier wife while still legally married to me. Quite the scandal, Victoria. I wonder what your new friends in town would think if they knew the truth about your character. They know all they need to know, Victoria replied, though inwardly she flinched at his implied threat to expose her to the community. Do they? James moved to the window, glancing out toward the barn where Sam could be seen watching the house vigilantly. Does your cowboy know he's harboring another man's wife? That the child he's grown attached to is mine by law and blood? Or have you spun him some tragic tale of widowhood to gain his sympathy and his protection? Victoria remained silent, unwilling to give James the satisfaction of confirming his suspicions. Her silence seemed to amuse him. I thought as much, he said with a satisfied smile. Well, it hardly matters. I've already spoken with the local magistrate, Judge Wilson, I believe. An influential man in these parts, from what I gather. He was most interested to learn about my runaway wife and child, particularly when I mentioned my willingness to invest in local enterprises. Horror dawned as Victoria realized the full extent of James's machinations. You're working with Wilson? Let's call it a mutually beneficial arrangement, James replied smoothly. The judge has certain ambitions for expanding his holdings, and I have certain skills in finance that could be of assistance. In return, he's been most helpful in locating you and has assured me of the local law's support in reclaiming my legal dependence. Victoria felt as if the walls were closing in. James had always been adept at finding allies in positions of power, at manipulating systems to serve his purposes. Ethan Hayes won't let you take us, she said, grasping at the one certainty she had left. When he returns, ah yes, Mr. Hayes, James interrupted, his tone dripping with disdain. Currently in Kansas City trying to salvage his failing ranch, I understand. How inconvenient for you that he's not here to play the hero. He approached Victoria slowly, like a predator stalking wounded prey. But even if he were, what could he do? I am your legal husband, Victoria. The law is on my side. Victoria backed away until she felt the wall behind her, trapped between it and James's advancing figure. The law doesn't know what you are, she said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to remain strong. What you've done. And who would believe you if you told them? James asked softly, now close enough that Victoria could smell the expensive cologne he favored. A respectable businessman against a woman who abandoned her husband and fled with his child, who stole his money and betrayed his trust. Be reasonable, Victoria. This can end one of two ways: you and Lily return with me voluntarily, or I use the full extent of the law to compel you. Either way, the outcome is the same. Victoria's mind raced, searching for any way out of the impossible situation. James was right about one thing legally: he held all the power. As his wife, Victoria had few rights of her own, and none that would allow her to keep Lily from him if he chose to assert his paternal authority. But something Ethan had said weeks ago came back to her. Truth's a heavy burden sometimes, but lies way more in the end. If she had any hope of protecting herself and Lily, it would have to be through truth, however painful or dangerous that might be. You're right about the law, James, Victoria conceded, forcing herself to meet his gaze steadily. But there are other considerations beyond legal ones. What will your business associates think when they learn about your gambling debts, the money you've embezzled from investors, the men you've cheated and threatened? James's expression froze, his confidence wavering for the first time. What are you talking about? I kept records, Victoria continued, the lie coming easily when so much was at stake. Dates, amounts, names. I made copies before I left St. Louis. Insurance, you might say, though I hoped never to need it. James's hand shot out, gripping her arm painfully. You're lying. You never had access to my business affairs. Victoria didn't flinch, though his fingers dug cruelly into her flesh. You'd be surprised what a wife notices when her husband thinks she's too stupid or too afraid to pay attention. I may not have understood everything I saw, but I understood enough to know it would ruin you if it became public. Uncertainty flickered in James's eyes, replaced quickly by calculation. He released her arm, stepping back slightly. Even if what you say is true, it changes nothing. You and Lily will return with me, whatever evidence you think you have can be dealt with privately. No, James, Victoria said firmly. We're not going anywhere with you, ever. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their standoff. James moved to the window, his expression darkening as he observed several riders entering the yard. It seems your cowboy friends have returned, he commented, his tone cold with anger. No matter, this discussion isn't finished, Victoria, not by any means. He retrieved his hat and gloves, his movements deliberate and controlled despite the rage Victoria could sense simmering beneath his composed exterior. I'll be at the hotel in Belmont for the next few days. Consider your options carefully. If I don't see you and the child by noon on Sunday, I'll return with the sheriff and legal documents that will force your compliance. Victoria said nothing, watching warily as James adjusted his hat and moved toward the door. At the threshold, he paused, looking back at her with an expression that chilled her blood. Don't mistake my patience for weakness, Victoria. You belong to me, as does my daughter. One way or another, I will reclaim what's mine. With that final threat hanging in the air, James stepped onto the porch, nodding curtly to Sam and the other cowboys who had gathered protectively near the house. He climbed into his waiting carriage with the dignified air of a man who was merely concluding a social call, rather than issuing an ultimatum. Victoria remained frozen in place until the carriage disappeared down the road, then sank shakily into the nearest chair, her legs no longer able to support her. The fear she had lived with for so long, temporarily forgotten in the safety of the Hayes Ranch, returned with crushing force. James had found them, and he would stop at nothing to take them back.